Winston Churchill was no stranger to grandiose military plans. As the first Lord of the Admiralty in World War I, he was the biggest booster of the Gallipoli campaign. The goal was to take the Ottoman Straits and force the Turks out of the war by attacking Constantinople directly, opening up Russia to Allied shipping through the Black Sea. This campaign ended with 250,000 casualties, and the Allies retreating from the Dardanelles. Churchill was personally blamed for the disaster by many members of Parliament and forced to resign his position. However, at the end of World War II, he was part of a plan that put Gallipoli to shame. It was called Operation Unthinkable. Operation Unthinkable was the name given to two potential war plans cooked up by the British Chiefs of Staff Committee against the USSR in 1945 at the command of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill was a rabid anti-communist who had only worked with Stalin out of necessity, viewing Hitler as the greater danger to Britain and her interests. He famously said, "If Hitler invaded hell, I'd at least make a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons." The first plan was for a surprise attack by the joint forces of America, Britain, Poland, and a rearmed German army against the USSR to impose the will of the Western liberal democracies on the Soviet behemoth, securing a square deal for Poland. This likely refers to Stalin's agreement at the Yalta Conference to allow free and fair elections for the Poles. However, Stalin would never allow this, because a free election would likely result in an anti-Soviet government. Churchill, rightly, deeply distrusted the man. He expressed his fears in a letter to the Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. "Terrible things have happened. A tide of Russian domination is sweeping forward. After it is over, the territories under Russian control will include the Baltic provinces, all of Eastern Germany, all Czechoslovakia, a large part of Austria, the whole of Yugoslavia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. This constitutes one of the most melancholy events in the history of Europe, and one to which there has been no parallel. It is to an early and speedy showdown and settlement with Russia that we must now turn our hopes." The plan was to drive the communists back into Russia, liberate Eastern Europe, and hopefully lead to regime change in Moscow by discontented Soviet citizens. Brigadier Jeffrey Thompson was the architect of the planned offensive. The battle that he envisioned would be a great drive east from Western Germany past Berlin, pushing the Red Army back to the Oder and Neisse rivers, 55 miles east of the ruined German capital. An armored clash was expected that would have dwarfed the Battle of Kursk with its 6,000 tanks. 8,000 tanks were expected to be involved in Operation Unthinkable. As the brigadier said, "We should be staking everything upon one great battle, in which we should be facing very heavy odds." Many others took issue with the plan, particularly the rearming of Hitler's army. General Hastings Ismay was quick to point out that the British public would find it abhorrent that they'd allied with the remnants of the Führer's army and attacked Stalin, after they'd spent years telling the British public that the Soviet Union was doing the lion's share of the fighting and endured untold suffering in the struggle against Germany. An attack on the Soviet Union would be catastrophic for morale in the democracies and be seen as duplicitous. The second plan was for a defense of Western Europe from a Soviet drive towards the North Sea and the Atlantic. Let's look at the first plan though. If Churchill had received consent for his plan from the Americans, could the Western Allies have succeeded in defeating the Soviet Union and driving them out of Poland? Well, to begin with, Churchill's plan required the element of surprise. However, because he had been so vocal about his opinions on the Soviet Union, Stalin would have been aware that his British ally didn't quite trust him. He had already made the mistake of trusting Hitler to not invade and being caught unaware in 1941. He's unlikely to have made the same mistake. Moreover, the Soviets had penetrated Allied intelligence so deeply that it's inconceivable that Stalin wouldn't be warned of their plans. The hypothetical start date for Operation Unthinkable was the 1st 1st of July 1945. This was before the Soviet invasion of Manchukuo, the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the surrender of Japan. British defense planners hypothesized that the Soviet Union would ally with Japan against the West. The Japanese military junta was firmly against communism, but by 1945, the empire was in dire straits, and they'd likely be open to compromising on their principles against a common foe. A surprise attack was to be launched by 47 British and American divisions around Dresden. At the time the attack was supposed to commence, the Western Allies had 64 American divisions, 35 divisions from Britain and Canada, 4 Polish divisions, and they believed that they'd be able to scrounge up 10 divisions from German prisoners of war. Altogether, this would have given them 113 divisions, including 23 armored divisions. Against that was arrayed 264 Soviet divisions, including 36 armored divisions. The Russians had 6.5 million troops on the German border alone, giving them a 2-to-1 immediate numerical superiority over the Allies. The balance in the air would be much more mixed. The Russians would have a 2-to-1 superiority in terms of tactical aircraft, but the Allies would have a 3-to-1 superiority in terms of strategic aircraft, and the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Force accrued a great deal of experience in strategic bombing campaigns against Germany. Despite pop culture depictions of the German army as a highly mechanized force, the Germans were heavily dependent on horses. Only about 20% of the Heer was mechanized or motorized during World War II. The American army was mostly motorized and mechanized, and the British weren't far behind them, giving the Allies an advantage in mobility that the Germans just didn't have. Likely the initial offensive would be halted by the Soviets, and a counter-offensive would push the Allies out of Germany. However, the Soviets would have difficulty moving forward due to Allied air interdiction. What the Allies did have on their side, though, was industrial strength. 2/3 of Allied military equipment during the war had been produced by America, and they were just getting started. In addition to this, the British and Americans had waited until 1944 to open up a major front against Germany, and had suffered far less casualties than the Soviets, who had lost 20 million people over 4 years of fighting. That means that the British, and especially the Americans, would be better able to replace their losses long term. However, that's the key here, long term. Any war with the Soviet Union was bound to drag on, not for months, but years. While time favored the Allies in many ways, America and Britain had liberal democratic governments and had to maintain public approval. Backstabbing an ally, arming the Germans, and starting a Third World War weren't likely to endear them to the British and American civilians, who were getting war-weary and wanted a return to normalcy. Combined British and American losses amounted to 2 million during the Second World War. In the Third World War against Russia, the number of casualties they suffered would likely dwarf that. After the initial defeats in Operation Unthinkable, public pressure is likely going to force the Americans and the British to seek peace terms, even though the Allies should be able to win a protracted war with the Soviet Union. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'm planning on making more alternate history videos. I also have a subscribe star if you're interested. If not, that's okay. I appreciate the viewership, and have a nice day.